Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, the presidential election, what's at stake for voters of color. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Ballot counting continues with former Vice President Joe Biden holding a slim lead in crucial battleground states. Should the former VP eventually win the White House, he'll have the overwhelming support of black and brown voters to thank. Because the record-breaking 160 million Americans who cast ballots in this presidential election also included huge turnouts by people of color. They already knew what the election returns reflect, that America is a divided nation and that race and racism is driving that division. Joining us, Dr. Paul Watanabe, professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston. Renee Landers, professor of law at Suffolk University and the faculty director of both the Masters of Science in Law Life Sciences program and the Health and Biomedical Law concentration. Dr. Tatish Nateta, associate professor of political science and director of UMass Poll at UMass Amherst. And Representative Liz Miranda, state representative for Suffolk County's 5th District. Her district comprises parts of Roxbury and the Dorchester neighborhoods of Boston. Welcome to all of you. First, just a quick update. The situation is fluid right now, and it's going to continue to change. So we're not going to know the finality of this in this conversation. Just so that you know, right now, the president is leading in Pennsylvania, the vice president, Joe Biden, is leading in Pennsylvania and Georgia. If, in fact, in Pennsylvania, it gets to the point where there is less than half a percentage point by state law, there must be a recount. In Georgia and in Wisconsin, where the president has said he will ask for a recount, you can request a recount, but it does not have to be so. It's not mandated by law. So that's what's happening now. And by the way, in Georgia, it's less than 1,000 vote difference as of this moment. So the situation is fluid, as we've said. Back to the point about black and brown and people of color voting that slim margin for Vice President Joe Biden. Paul Watanabe, here's something from Michael Harriot. He's a columnist from The Root. He says, "Dear white people, are you enjoying that legal marijuana? Like that stimulus check? Is your water clean? Did you mail in your ballot? Black voters did that. You're welcome." Talk to me about the numbers as we're seeing them now in the urban areas, which definitely reflect an overwhelming turnout by those voters. Dr. Watanabe.
Well, this is one of those, I don't know how to think of this as a glass half full or half empty. I guess half full is you have one of the worst presidents we've ever had in the history of the country on racial issues and other issues who's no longer going to be there. If the will of the people prevails, and I hope that it does, I'm convinced that he will no longer be the president if the will of the people that was the opinions that were cast on Tuesday are the ones that prevail. On the other hand, as you pointed out, it's a glass half empty. And the reason it's glass half empty is 70 million Americans, at least, voted for this guy to be president of the United States. And 70 millions of them are overwhelmingly white people, for example. There's a clear racial divide in terms of the support for these candidates. And to think that 70 million Americans voted for this, probably the worst president we've ever had in our history, it makes you wonder, what does it take to lose an election in the United States and lose so decisively? That's a great concern that I have, and the extent to which the Republican advantage was retained within the Senate, or appears to be so, and the Republicans actually gained in the House of Representatives. It's a sobering reality for people of color, and I think all people who care about some of the issues that have arisen within the last few months, including that risen by Black Lives Matter in terms of racial justice. So it's a sobering reality I think we have a few days after the election.
Renee Landers, the president has not only threatened but has gone through with many, many court challenges. They're still underway now. There is probably more to come. It appears from my naked eye as just a regular consumer that all of them are really concentrated around issues of voter suppression. Would you clarify that? As everything that the president is challenging about ballot counting or voters or whatever the various complaints are, they seem to all center around voter suppression and particularly about people of color.
Well, he does seem to want to suppress the votes that would count against him, would be for Vice President Biden, and to allow the votes that were in favor of him to be counted. And so that right away tells you that it's a result-oriented effort with these challenges to some of the election processes. On the other hand, he did win one challenge to allowing observers and how close they could be to the vote counters in Pennsylvania. So I think that those, sort of sensible process challenges, any candidate should be able to bring those. But some of the others that are aimed at not allowing votes that were legitimately cast before Election Day, especially under state laws where the votes can be counted, within a certain amount of time after the Election Day, that those challenges are really frivolous and really embarrassing for a democracy like ours, because people who voted following the rules, their votes should be counted in the election.
And just to go back to that, observers close enough, there were observers from both parties, as is required, there. But the argument was they weren't close enough, so they got closer access. Okay.
That's right. They were, I think that the election officials, if memory serves, were keeping them about 20 feet away, which, you really can't really see what's going on if you're that far away. And I think that they're now allowed to be within 6 feet of the people doing the counting, so then they could actually observe what the count is about.
Okay. Tatish, you've said that what drove a lot of the voters of color to the polls was really the voter suppression, and it was widespread and it was intense. Explain.
Yeah, I think if you look back at this election season, one of the central themes is that the Republican Party recognized that this was going to be a very high turnout election, but in particular, high turnout election for people of color, more specifically for African Americans in swing states. One of the conclusions of the 2016 election is that Donald Trump won in large part not only by mobilizing the white working class, but by suppressing, either through his campaign or through surrogates of his campaign in foreign nations, the African American vote, which overwhelmingly supports the Democratic candidate. And so we saw some repeats of these attempts to suppress the African American vote, to make, the vote, the franchise, much more trying, much more costly for the African American community. And I think that anger about that suppression in 16 and in 20 mobilized a large segment of the Black community to turn out to vote, to take those high costs associated with voting in person, waiting in line, taking the days off of work, getting childcare. And that, as we're going to see, I think, propelled Biden to the presidency.
So, Liz, following up on that, you spent some time in Detroit on the ground there. You were unopposed in your race and won. Congratulations. But what comes out of your work there and what comes out from other organizers is that Black, brown, folks of color are very pragmatic in their voting. This is not, we love you, Joe Biden. This is, we are thinking in a larger global sense about what this means long term. So talk about what you heard on the ground in Detroit.
I think it's really interesting. First, I want to give a shout out to the members of DLive, an organization working with current and former gang members who are really on the ground talking to the people that matter the most. And I just want to say that Michigan went blue for Biden. And part of that is because I do believe that the Democratic Party, not only in Massachusetts, but across this country, has really an identity crisis. Its base, its loyal base, are people of color, are working class people, newsflash, that include people of color. And I think what we saw is communities of color, Philly, Milwaukee, Detroit, you have Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, all these these communities delivering for the Democratic Party, not because the Democratic Party invested in them, but because coalitions were formed. Are you seeing what's happening in Georgia, thanks to Stacey Abrams and 40 plus organizations working with the AAPI community, the Latinx community, unions, working on the ground for 2 years. She lost and didn't turn her back on her own state. She decided to work on voter suppression. And I just want to say that part of the legislature, I'm incredibly proud here in Massachusetts. And while talking to these gentlemen, many who were like, my vote doesn't count, is that there's a lot of miseducation and information to communities, particularly returning citizens who are coming to our cities and towns across this country, who are not valued, who are not engaged in a way that they feel that they're a part of the vote. And so I want to hope, I know Biden's going to pull through, but I hope that the Democratic Party takes a long look at itself, because the return on investment to its loyal base has not been realized. And I just hope that we know that, one thing I heard from a young brother, he was like, mass incarceration is happening under Democratic leadership. And so if we are the party of the people, we must reckon with our own history of bias and structural racism and supremacy that has been in our history.
So I want to put on the table one interesting fact that has surfaced thus far. Again, to say situation is still fluid. A lot of data is still not firm. Tatish and Paul, I know you'll echo this. But something that I found very interesting is that in areas where the COVID-19 crisis is the highest, and we know we've talked on this program about Black, brown, people of color being hardest hit during this time. But the electorate in those areas seem to have leaned toward President Trump. Paul Watanabe, help me understand what was going on there as much as you can.
Well, I think there is a racial element to the COVID crisis, and there is a racial element to America. To the extent that the COVID crisis was originally focused on large urban areas, meant people of color, it meant people in many white rural areas could say it was not a crisis, it was a hoax, you didn't have to pretend to it. When it's moved to those areas, I think there's been this delayed reaction. I don't think they quite believe it, and now they're realizing it might be a serious problem. It may not be reflected in the vote, but now they're dealing with it and understanding it's not simply a problem that impacts people of color. When it was impacting people of color, it was something easily to dismiss and say the economy took precedence over that. Now they're seeing firsthand that the COVID crisis is one that's now reaching into areas that are principally white. But on the point about race and these challenges, let me tell you this. When the president spoke the other day, the last time we heard him, and he gave this screed about America and about the democratic system, I think the worst part was the racist screed when he talked about Philadelphia and Detroit as being chronically, there's no question about what he was signaling. He was saying that they're principally black areas. That's what he was saying. It was a racist taunt. It was he's gone back to his roots. The most basic beliefs come forward, and they're racist to the core, and that's disgusting coming from the president of the United States. And there are many things disgusting in that remarks the other day, but that was at the core racist.
I just want to underscore or to explain what you just said, and that is the president the other night came out and said the election is being stolen from him. I know he's been saying that throughout the campaign, but this is from the White House, and he indicated several areas because, as we just said, at the time that he spoke, he was a little bit ahead in Pennsylvania. And now, as we said at the beginning of this show, Vice President Biden has passed him. And so, and looking at where the areas were yet to be counted, hundreds of thousands of votes, they were coming from the areas that Paul was noting. Tatish, weigh in on that, if you would, about this COVID leaning toward Trump. Do you agree with what Paul has said?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an example in which you can pretty much declare that partisanship is a hell of a drug. I mean, I think what you're seeing is that in those areas that have had increasing spikes in the coronavirus, these are also very highly Republican districts, Republican counties, and Republican states. And as Paul said, the COVID pandemic has moved from urban areas, cities, to rural areas. But even in the midst of a pandemic which has infected millions of Americans and has cost the lives of close to 250,000 Americans, that people look to their partisanship, look to their ideology as their guiding light. And that is, of course, mixed up, as historians and political scientists and sociologists and many others have studied. This is clearly mixed up with race, right? So partisanship in the United States today has a racial dynamic in which people of color are largely identified and connected to the Democratic Party, and whites are connected to the Republican Party. So there's a racial dynamic, there's a partisan dynamic. These are both intertwined. On Paul's point regarding the president's use of cities as synonyms for African Americans, he's been doing this since he was a candidate. He's talked about Philadelphia and Baltimore and Detroit and Oakland during the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. He did it previously during the protests regarding police violence, speaking about Baltimore. And the idea is to create a picture in the heads of his supporters. He can't come out and say that African Americans are a threat to their well-being, but he can paint the picture by focusing on cities that are historically African American. And this is part and parcel of his campaign strategy in terms of mobilizing the white vote, mobilizing racism, whether that's explicit or implicit. And so it's par for the course. I think the great thing is that, going forward, I don't think that we're going to be seeing these types of appeals from the White House.
Renee, weigh in.
Oh, so I wanted to say I see a connection on several factors in this divide. The opposition to the Affordable Care Act, the refusal to the characterization of the COVID-19 pandemic as a hoax, denial of climate change, and then denial that racism is still a problem in the country. That the exit polls show that the overwhelming majority of white voters just do not see the value in any of those things, and just think about the economy. And so part of that, I think, is this rejection of looking at the facts and what's happening around you, and instead, as Tatish was saying, focusing on ideology, looking at everything through this ideological lens, which then allows you to pretend that none of these things are real problems. I mean, the president has fostered this, right? That COVID is a hoax. We wouldn't hear about it unless they were trying to get me. Climate change, that's a hoax. We've withdrawn from the Paris, climate change accord. And, we're going to have, try to restore coal as, the principal fuel in the country, which, the economy has moved past that already. And then this denial of that racism a problem, these executive orders he's released in recent weeks, prohibiting federal contractors and federal agencies from doing any kind of training around implicit bias or systemic racism. All of this is about denying real problems that exist and then making it impossible for the political system to deal with them in an effective way. And the problem is that there are real costs. The Affordable Care Act issue and the COVID crisis are inextricably linked, right? People will not have health care, right, for COVID or anything else if, the system is allowed to destroy the Affordable Care Act. And I'm not saying the Affordable Care Act is a perfect solution, but it's a platform from which we can make progress. So I just see this as part of this larger problem. And I agree with Paul and Tatish that race are a very big component of it, because it's very easy to characterize these problems as afflicting people who are not like you and who are somehow undeserving. And those people are Black and brown.
So, Liz, this is where you live. I mean, for real. So this is, an issue that's been so present in the district that you represent and in your life, because you're a COVID survivor. So you hear that statistic. What do you think?
So first and foremost, Donald Trump has shown us who he is. This is a gentleman, the occupant, soon to be evicted from the White House, I hope, who's put children in cages. He's had the Muslim ban. He's railroaded a nominee, now a Supreme Court justice, who's never tried an appeal. This is a man who has not only fueled racism in this country, but has tried to erase the history of genocide against indigenous people and people of color in this country. And I live in Roxbury. It is the 5th Suffolk district is the most of color district. and the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In April, my family and I were not shielded by my title. My grandmother passed away, God rest her soul, and I had COVID among 20 members of my family and counting. And what we have is, I really believe that the narrative, I'm actually going to stay away from sort of this ideology that actually that this race is actually close. I mean, you have Biden winning ahead about probably close to 4 million popular votes ahead of Trump here in this country. And if we didn't have the Electoral College, the man who was voted with the most votes would actually be winning. And what I think is happening, if you go to the east side of Detroit where I was, this is a community that has not recovered from the race riots of the late 60s. This is on us. Our cities have been disinvested in. The environmental injustice that is happening in communities like Roxbury and Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Southwest Atlanta. This is something that has happened on our watch. And, you know, I want to say something about this COVID crisis. It also is attached really to an economic crisis and a housing crisis, because in this country, its history of redlining has left our cities incredibly housing segregated. You have communities where are 80-90% African American, Asian communities, and Latinx communities that have been not paid attention with by the Democratic Party. And I hope that what I'm seeing, hearing from everyone, even including the polls, one of the things that was clear to me was that people were not telling the polls the truth. Folks were still voting for Trump. We have white women. White women, I want to talk to you for a moment. Black women have always and continue to be the mules of this party and have saved democracy yet again. But you doubled down. You actually increased your support from 53% to 55% for Donald Trump. And the issues of reproductive justice not only impact us, but impact you. And so what we have is that we want to tell the truth, that it's not the Latinx small population in Miami that voted for Trump that gave him this win. It's not Black voters in the South. It is white people in this country trying to uphold supremacy.
All right, we have a little bit of time, and I just want to get Tatish. I have to go where you live. The polls were wrong. I'm picking up from Liz Miranda. Help me.
I mean, I would say let's wait till all the votes are counted.
I know that's what you all say, but I'm just telling you right now they're wrong.
Can't call for votes being counted and then declare that polling is wrong. I will say that some state level polls were wrong, but I think a lot of the issues that people have are a reflection of 2016. There's actually no real evidence that there are shy Trump voters. I think one of the central problems with polling that we have today is that there's a overwhelming level of distrust of various institutions, and pollsters are one of those areas in which people distrust. The people that distrust pollsters most particularly are Trump voters. And so polling has a problem in getting Trump voters into actual polls to make representative samples. I think it's also a reflection of the way in which polls are used. Polls are not soothsayers. This is not Ides of March. This is not Julius Caesar. They tell a picture when the polling occurs. And so, the media has used this in a predictive fashion, but pollsters never, and myself included, never intend for these to be predictive. If you want predictive models, you can go to forecast models. And those forecast models actually got it right. If you look at political science forecast models, they all said Biden. They said Biden about 52% to 48% for Trump. So I think the declaration that polls are dead and polls got it wrong we should take a moment. And second, pollsters should also recognize that we didn't get everything right, but we did get a few things right in this election.
Paul Watanabe, just to ask you a question about polling, do you think it's because it's a class issue, that the people who respond to polls are likely to be college-educated people who would respond to polls, and so we're missing a wide swath of people?
Well, that might be part of it, but as somebody who's defended polls a lot, I really do think that there's something to your complaint, Kelly, about the polls, because as Professor Nteta says, trust is critical, and if trust is broken, that means you're giving the responses that are illegitimate responses. They may not be credible responses. And when you don't give credible responses to polling, the whole foundation of polling falls apart, because it's all based on the credibility of people's responses. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. I don't think it's simply the question is there a Trump phenomenon? People are not willing to give their truth about their opinions about Trump or Republicans. I think there's a view that polling itself, there's some questions about the veracity of it because there's a distrust of the mechanism itself. And in terms of the media, I agree also with the notion that we rely way too much on the media to be driven by polls. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but many people in the media, the news organizations, so forth, it's easy for them to cover elections by looking at polls. It's like keeping score. You don't have to look into deep sort of issues about policy and where people stand and so forth and really dig deep in terms of what's happening. You simply look at a number, and anybody can look at a number. Anybody can say what the score is at any point along a game in the election game. And I think that we're going to have to, it's not only the pollsters, but the people who use polls, and particularly the media, has to rethink again its reliance on them for its analysis and so forth.
All right. Well, we have to get to some other big issues like the youth vote and what I believe has shown in the Latinx vote, what African-American voters have been saying all the time, everybody's not a monolith. But that's to come.
Absolutely.
At this moment. This is the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. Stay with us, however, as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter.